October 3, 1849, Baltimore, Maryland. The air was damp and heavy as early autumn settled over the city. Outside a public house known as Gunner's Hall, a man lay slumped near the entrance, barely conscious. His clothes were worn and ill-fitting, not quite his size and stained from days of neglect. He drifted in and out of awareness, muttering fragments of words no one around him could fully understand. Among those fragments, one name surfaced repeatedly: Reynolds. The man was Edgar Allan Poe. By 1849, Poe was already a figure of literary notoriety. Born in 1809, orphaned young, raised in the household of John Allan in Richmond, Virginia, he had lived a life marked by ambition, instability, and loss. His poetry and tales of the macabre had earned him recognition, if not financial security. He was known for works that explored death, madness, and premature burial with unsettling precision. Yet outside the page, Poe was also a man who struggled financially. Emotionally and perhaps physically. In the weeks before he was found in Baltimore, Poe had been traveling. He left Richmond on September 27, 1849, intending to travel north. He was engaged to be married again, attempting to stabilize his life after years of hardship, including the death of his wife Virginia Clem from tuberculosis. Friends described him in those days as sober and hopeful, focused on lecturing and rebuilding his career. Then, somewhere between Richmond and Baltimore, he vanished from reliable record. 6 days later, he reappeared on that Baltimore street, disoriented and wearing clothes that were not his own. A printer named Joseph Walker discovered him and recognized his name. Walker wrote a note to Dr. Joseph Snodgrass, an acquaintance of Poe's, urging immediate assistance. Poe was described as in great distress, in need of aid. He was taken to Washington College Hospital. There, physicians attempted to treat him, though records from the hospital have since been lost. Accounts from those present describe him as alternating between agitation and near silence. He reportedly called out the name Reynolds several times. He could not coherently explain how he had come to be in Baltimore, nor why he wore another man's clothing. Over the next 4 days, his condition deteriorated. On October 7, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe died. The official cause of death was recorded vaguely as congestion of the brain, a term used broadly in the 19th century for various neurological or inflammatory conditions. It was not a precise diagnosis. No autopsy report survives. The hospital records are missing. What remains are scattered letters and recollections, written after the fact. The first major reveal in this case is not a clear answer, but the unsettling fact that key documentation simply does not exist. The absence of medical records leaves historians and investigators working from secondary accounts, each colored by personal bias and incomplete memory. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Case Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. One of the earliest and most persistent theories surrounding Poe's death is alcohol. Poe had a complicated relationship with drinking. Some contemporaries described him as highly sensitive to alcohol, claiming even small amounts would severely affect him. Others accused him of periodic binge drinking. Dr. Snodgrass, who wrote publicly about Poe after his death, strongly promoted the idea that Poe had died as a result of alcoholism. Yet Snodgrass was a temperance advocate, and some scholars believe his accounts may have been influenced by his moral campaign. Witnesses in Richmond, shortly before Poe's departure, insisted he had been sober and committed to abstinence. His fiancée reportedly believed he was stable and focused. If alcohol alone caused his death, it would suggest a sudden and severe relapse within days of leaving Richmond. Possible, but not conclusively proven. Another theory points to cooping, a practice reportedly used in mid-19th century American elections. Baltimore's elections were known for corruption and violence. Cooping involved kidnapping individuals, holding them captive, forcing them to consume alcohol or drugs, disguising them in different clothes, and coercing them into voting multiple times under different identities. Gunner's Hall, where Poe was found, was being used as a polling place on October 3rd, Election Day. The borrowed clothing becomes central here. Those who knew Poe insisted the garments he wore when found did not belonged to him. They were described as cheap, ill-fitting, and inconsistent with his usual attire. If Poe had been a victim of cooping, it might explain both the strange clothing and his delirium. He may have been beaten, drugged, or intoxicated against his will. However, no direct evidence ties him definitively to such an operation. The theory fits circumstantial details but lacks documentation. Medical speculation offers additional possibilities. Rabies has been proposed based on a 1996 medical analysis that reviewed descriptions of his symptoms. Rabies can cause agitation, confusion, and fluctuating consciousness, sometimes without the classic symptom of hydrophobia in early stages, yet there is no record of a dog bite. Other hypotheses include epilepsy, diabetes, carbon monoxide poisoning, influenza, brain tumor, or even heavy metal poisoning. One theory suggests that Poe may have suffered from a brain lesion or tumor. Years after his burial, when his remains were moved to a more prominent grave in 1875, observers reportedly noted an unusual mass within his skull. Some interpreted this as a calcified brain lesion. Others argue it may have been a natural postmortem phenomenon. As the brain can sometimes solidify under certain burial conditions, the name Reynolds remains another unresolved element. Who was Reynolds? Some suggest Poe may have been referring to Jeremiah N. Reynolds, an explorer and lecturer Poe admired. Others argue it could have been a local political operative, or simply a fragmented utterance without significance. No clear connection has ever been established. There is also the possibility of assault. Baltimore in 1849 was not a quiet city. Violence, particularly around election periods, was not uncommon. If Poe had been robbed or beaten, his confusion and borrowed clothing might be explained. Yet again, there is no surviving police report detailing such an incident. It is as though the most critical hours of his final days dissolved into silence. The contradictions between accounts complicate the narrative further. Some witnesses described him as drunk. Others insisted he was sober but feverish. Some recalled him calm at moments, others violent and incoherent. Without primary medical records, each retelling becomes less certain. What is known is this: Edgar Allan Poe left Richmond coherent and purposeful. Within a week, he was found delirious on a Baltimore street, wearing another man's clothes. He never regained sufficient clarity to explain what had happened. 4 days later, he was dead. In death, Poe's reputation grew. His literary executor, Rufus Griswold, published an obituary and later a memoir that portrayed Poe as morally unstable and self-destructive. Many of Griswold's claims were later disputed, yet they shaped public perception for years. The mystery of Poe's death became intertwined with the dark themes of his writing. Almost too fittingly, today, nearly 2 centuries later, the case remains officially unresolved. There is no confirmed cause of death, no definitive explanation for the borrowed clothes, no verified identity for Reynolds. The hospital records are gone. The witnesses are long deceased. What remains is a narrow timeline, a handful of letters, and the image of a man who built his career exploring madness and mortality, ultimately leaving the world under circumstances that mirror his own fiction. On October 7, 1849, at the age of 40, Edgar Allan Poe died in Baltimore. Whether from illness, violence, political crime, or a convergence of factors, the truth slipped away almost immediately, and perhaps that is the final irony. The author who mastered the art of suspense left behind a final chapter without resolution, a case file that remains open. In the decades that followed his death, the mystery did not fade. Instead, it deepened. As Baltimore expanded and modern medicine advanced, the gaps in Edgar Allan Poe's final days became more visible, not less. Each new generation attempted to re-examine the case with contemporary knowledge, yet every theory eventually encountered the same obstacle: the silence left by missing records and unreliable testimony. The hospital where Poe died, Washington College Hospital, no longer stands. Its archives, including admission logs and physician notes from October 1849, have vanished. Whether destroyed by time, fire, neglect, or simple misplacement is unknown. Without those documents, investigators are forced to rely on letters written by attending physician Dr. John Joseph Moran. Moran's accounts, however, changed over time. In some versions, Poe was calm and resigned in his final hours. In others, he was raving and tormented. The inconsistencies have raised serious doubts about Moran's reliability, Moran described. Poe's final night is restless, he claimed. Poe repeatedly called out, "Lord, help my poor soul," before slipping into unconsciousness. Yet earlier accounts from others suggested the repeated word was Reynolds. The discrepancy is significant. Was Poe invoking a name tied to a person? Or was he uttering a fragmented plea misunderstood by listeners? When key witnesses alter their stories, even slightly, the foundation of the case weakens. By the late 19th century, public fascination with Poe had grown. Literary scholars sought to protect his legacy from accusations of chronic drunkenness. Temperance advocates, meanwhile, continued to cite his death as a cautionary tale about alcohol. Competing narratives formed around the same limited evidence. The truth became secondary to the symbolism attached to his life. The cooping theory gained particular traction in the 20th century. Historians documented widespread election fraud in mid-19th century Baltimore. Gangs were known to abduct vulnerable men, hold them in hidden rooms, and force them to vote repeatedly under threat or intoxication. Victims were often dressed in different clothes to avoid detection at polling stations. Gunner's Hall, where Poe was found, functioned as both a tavern and polling place during the election on October 3, 1849. The alignment of dates is difficult to ignore. Poe was discovered on Election Day. He was wearing clothes not his own. He was found near a polling location. His physical and mental distress could align with forced intoxication or abuse. However, no contemporary newspaper directly connected Poe to election violence. No witness stepped forward claiming to have seen him coerced. The theory rests on probability, not proof. Medical reevaluation in the 1990s attempted to strip away moral judgment and focus strictly on symptoms. A team of physicians reviewed Moran's descriptions and proposed rabies as a plausible cause. Rabies can present with fluctuating consciousness, agitation, and death within days once neurological symptoms appear. The absence of hydrophobia in the record does not eliminate the possibility, as not all patients exhibit classic signs. Yet again, there is no record of an animal bite. In 1849, even if Poe had been bitten weeks earlier, it may not have been considered relevant. Another line of inquiry suggests metabolic disorders. Diabetes, untreated in the 19th century, could lead to confusion and coma. Severe infections, including encephalitis or meningitis, might produce similar delirium. Influenza was widespread at the time. Brain lesions, as speculated during the reburial, could explain behavioral instability. Each explanation fits certain aspects of the narrative, but none accounts for all of it, particularly the clothing. The clothing remains one of the most tangible anomalies. Poe was known to take care with his appearance despite financial hardship. Friends described him as particular about dress when traveling. The garments he wore in Baltimore were described as coarse and mismatched. If he had sold his own clothes for money, that fact might have been reported. If he had been robbed, injuries might have been documented. The silence around how he acquired those clothes remains unresolved. Some modern scholars propose a more personal possibility that Poe suffered a psychological break. His life had been marked by repeated trauma, abandonment in childhood, financial instability, professional rivalries, the prolonged illness and death of his wife. He was traveling alone. Stress, combined with underlying health issues, may have culminated in disorientation. In such a state, he could have wandered, lost possessions, and become vulnerable to exploitation. Yet even this explanation struggles to clarify why he was found precisely where he was on Election Day, outside a polling site. The broader context of 1849 Baltimore cannot be ignored. The city was turbulent. Immigration, political factionalism, and economic instability contributed to unrest. Violence was not uncommon, particularly during elections. A solitary, disoriented man would have been an easy target if Poe had been Assaulted or manipulated, those responsible may have had no reason to come forward. Especially if the victim was already perceived as unstable, there is also the matter of time. From September 27th to October 3rd, Poe's movements are largely unverified. He was supposed to travel to Philadelphia, possibly to edit a collection of poems. There are no confirmed records placing him there. It is possible he never reached his intended destination. It is possible he returned to Baltimore earlier than assumed. Those missing days form a gap large enough for multiple scenarios to unfold. The absence of evidence has allowed the story to evolve alongside Poe's literary image. His works, including The Telltale Heart and The Fall of the House of Usher, explore unreliable narration and psychological collapse. Some observers have projected those themes backward onto his death, as if the circumstances were an extension of his art, yet the real man was not a fictional character. He was a patient in a hospital bed, attended by physicians who failed to preserve a clear account of his condition. In 1875, when Poe's remains were moved to a more prominent monument in Baltimore's Westminster Cemetery, thousands attended the ceremony. By then, he had become a literary icon. The mystery of his death was part of his legend. But legend is not resolution. It is the preservation of uncertainty. Today, scholars continue to debate the most plausible explanation. Rabies remains medically consistent with certain reported symptoms. Cooping aligns with the location and date. Alcohol relapse is supported by some witness accounts, though contradicted by others. Chronic illness could underlie all of it. It is also possible that multiple factors converged: physical weakness, environmental exposure, exploitation by others, and inadequate medical care. What is undeniable is the fragility of historical truth. Without documentation, even a public figure's death can dissolve into speculation. Edgar Allan Poe's final words, whether Reynolds or a plea for divine mercy, were recorded by men whose accounts conflict. His final diagnosis was written in vague terminology. His final explanation was never spoken clearly. The case remains open not because it lacks theories, but because it lacks certainty. And in that uncertainty, Poe's death mirrors the ambiguity he so often crafted in fiction. A narrative suspended between rational explanation and lingering doubt. On a quiet October morning in 1849, a man was found in borrowed clothes, calling out a name no one could place. 4 days later, he was gone. Nearly 2 centuries have passed, yet the essential question endures: what truly happened in those missing days before Edgar Allan Poe died on a Baltimore street remains one of literary history's most enduring mysteries. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the mystery surrounding Edgar Allan Poe's death shifted from personal tragedy to historical puzzle. What had once been a local event in Baltimore became a case study in how fragile truth can become when filtered through rumor, bias, and time. In the years immediately following his burial, Poe's reputation was shaped as much by his enemies as by his admirers. Rufus Wilmot Griswold, a literary rival, appointed himself Poe's literary executor. Through obituaries and memoirs, he depicted Poe as unstable, immoral, and perpetually intoxicated. These portrayals were accepted widely, partly because they filled the informational vacuum left by missing records. The narrative of self-destruction was simple. It required no investigation into missing clothes, no inquiry into election violence, no scrutiny of hospital care. It was a moral explanation in an era that preferred them, yet as scholars began re-examining Poe's letters and the accounts of those who had seen him shortly before his journey, a different portrait emerged. Friends in Richmond described him as optimistic and disciplined. In late September 1849, he had joined the Sons of Temperance and reportedly avoided alcohol. He was planning a wedding. He was organizing lectures. There was no clear indication of collapse. This contrast between stability in Richmond and delirium in Baltimore is one of the most unsettling elements of the case. Something occurred in those intervening days. The change was abrupt. When historians analyze cases with limited evidence, they examine patterns. One recurring pattern in mid-19th century Baltimore was organized election coercion. Reports from newspapers and court documents confirm that gangs operated in the city, particularly during elections. Victims were often chosen for vulnerability travelers, laborers, men without immediate family nearby. They were detained in back rooms, intoxicated, sometimes beaten, and forced to vote repeatedly. Clothes were swapped to alter appearance. The parallels to Poe's situation are circumstantial yet striking. He was a traveler. He was alone. He was found outside a polling place on election day. He wore unfamiliar clothing. He was disoriented and physically compromised, but even within the cooping theory, uncertainties persist. Most documented victims of cooping survived. They eventually reported their experiences. Poe, by contrast, never regained clarity. If he was coerced, what made his case fatal? Was he physically weaker? Did he suffer a pre-existing condition that made forced intoxication more dangerous? Or was violence involved that went unrecorded? Violence is a possibility that cannot be dismissed. Baltimore in 1849 had limited centralized policing. Assaults could go undocumented, especially if the victim lacked clear memory. If Poe was struck on the head, even once, it might have resulted in a subdural hematoma, a slow internal bleed, leading to confusion and death days later. Modern medicine recognizes this pattern. 19th century physicians did not. The report of a brain lesion during Poe's 1875 reinterment has fueled speculation for decades. Witnesses claimed that when his coffin was opened, much of his body had decomposed, yet a hardened mass remained inside the skull. Some interpreted this as a tumor. However, medical historians note that under certain burial conditions, brain tissue can form a hardened residue. The account, like many others, lacks scientific verification. It is a memory recorded years later. Rabies remains one of the more medically structured theories. A 1996 review by physicians at the University of Maryland Medical Center examined Morin's descriptions and concluded that rabies fit the clinical timeline: sudden delirium, fluctuating lucidity, rapid decline, and death within days. Rabies can incubate for weeks or months before symptoms emerge. If Poe had been bitten by an animal during his travels, the connection may not have been made. Yet rabies often involves severe throat spasms and fear of water, symptoms not clearly documented. Again, the evidence is incomplete. Other researchers suggest carbon monoxide poisoning, though this would typically require prolonged exposure to combustion fumes. Influenza complicated by encephalitis is another possibility. The autumn of 1849 saw outbreaks of infectious diseases in several American cities. Without laboratory tests or preserved tissue, such diagnoses remain speculative. Then there is the simplest explanation, a combination of factors. Travel fatigue, dehydration, stress, and underlying illness could have made Poe vulnerable. If he encountered opportunistic criminals during election chaos, even minor abuse might have tipped him into irreversible decline. In 1849, hospital care was limited. Intravenous fluids did not exist. Antibiotics were unknown. Sedatives were crude. A patient in delirium could deteriorate rapidly. Dr. Morin's shifting accounts continue to complicate reconstruction. In later lectures, Morin embellished details, sometimes portraying himself as a close confidant of Poe. Historians have noted contradictions between his early letters and later public speeches. Each inconsistency widens the uncertainty. The missing hospital records are perhaps the most critical loss. Admission logs might have listed physical injuries. Treatment notes could have clarified symptoms. Without them, the case relies on second-hand recollections. It is a reminder that even documented deaths can become opaque when record-keeping fails. Beyond medical and criminal theories lies a psychological dimension. Poe's life had been marked by instability from childhood. Orphaned at a young age, separated from siblings, financially dependent yet estranged from his foster father, he navigated repeated loss. The prolonged illness of his wife Virginia placed emotional strain on him for years. Grief can weaken the body as well as the mind. Depression can alter judgment and physical resilience. Some scholars propose that Poe may have experienced a severe depressive or psychotic episode during his journey. If he became disoriented, he might have wandered, misplaced possessions, or trusted the wrong individuals. In an unfamiliar environment, confusion can escalate quickly. Yet even this explanation circles back to the same unanswered questions. How did he end up at Gunner's Hall, and why was he wearing different clothes? The name Reynolds remains unresolved. Jeremiah and Reynolds, the explorer, had delivered lectures Poe admired years earlier. Could Poe have been recalling a literary influence in delirium? Or was Reynolds someone present in Baltimore during the election? No definitive link has been proven. The word lingers in the historical record without anchor. Over time, Poe's death has become inseparable from his literary identity. The man who wrote about premature burial, unreliable perception, and psychological terror died in a manner that invites similar interpretation. But separating myth from fact is essential. His fiction was deliberate, his death was not crafted. It was endured. In 2009, on the bicentennial of his birth, exhibitions and academic conferences revisited the mystery. Scholars emphasized caution. They acknowledged the appeal of dramatic explanations but stressed the limits of evidence. In forensic analysis, absence of proof cannot become proof of conspiracy. What remains certain is the timeline. September 27, 1849. Poe leaves Richmond. Coherent and composed. October 3rd, he is found delirious in Baltimore, wearing unfamiliar clothes outside a polling location. October 7th, he dies in Washington College Hospital. Between those dates lies a gap history has not filled. The endurance of the mystery speaks. Less to hidden secrets and more to lost information. In an era before standardized medical documentation and centralized law enforcement records, events could vanish into anecdote. When witnesses disagree and documents disappear, speculation thrives. Nearly 2 centuries later, Edgar Allan Poe's final days remain unresolved, not because no one has searched for answers, but because the essential evidence was never secured. His case illustrates how quickly truth can fragment. He was 40 years old. He was traveling with plans for the future. He was found in borrowed clothes, calling out a name that history cannot place. Whether victim of illness, crime, or tragic coincidence, he died without explaining what had happened, and so the file remains open. Not in a courthouse, but in the quiet persistence of unanswered questions. As the 20th century moved into the modern forensic age, Edgar Allan Poe's final days were re-examined not only by literary historians, but by physicians, criminologists, and archivists attempting to reconstruct a death without a body of evidence. The irony was unmistakable. A writer who explored the psychology of deduction in stories like those featuring August Duping became the subject of a case that resisted deduction at every turn, one of the most methodical modern approaches to the case has been comparative symptom analysis. Researchers have attempted to align reported behaviors with known medical conditions, constructing timelines based on Moran's early letters rather than his later public recollections. When stripped of embellishment, the consistent details are limited: fluctuating consciousness, confusion, agitation, inability to explain events, and death within 4 days of hospitalization. Those symptoms are broad. They can indicate infection, poisoning, trauma, withdrawal, metabolic imbalance, or neurological crisis. Without laboratory tests, each possibility remains plausible. In contemporary medicine, a patient presenting with such symptoms would undergo blood analysis, brain imaging, toxicology screening, and infection panels. In 1849, physicians relied on observation and rudimentary physical examination. Treatments might include bloodletting, purgatives, or sedatives, interventions that could worsen an already fragile condition. The absence of detailed treatment notes leaves open another question. Did medical care contribute to his decline? 19th century hospitals were not the controlled environments known today. Sanitation standards were inconsistent. Dehydration was poorly managed. If Poe arrived malnourished or exhausted, even standard practices of the era could have accelerated deterioration. Another avenue of inquiry focuses on toxic exposure. Some scholars have suggested heavy metal poisoning, particularly lead or mercury, substances present in certain medicines and environments of the time. Chronic exposure could lead to neurological symptoms. However, there is no direct evidence that Poe had recently ingested toxic quantities without preserved tissue samples. Such theories cannot advance beyond speculation. Alcohol withdrawal has also been proposed as an alternative to intoxication. If Poe had indeed abstained for weeks and then consumed alcohol abruptly, his body, especially if compromised by illness, might have reacted unpredictably. Severe withdrawal can produce delirium tremens, marked by agitation, confusion, and hallucinations. Yet delirium tremens typically occurs after sustained heavy drinking followed by sudden cessation. The timeline remains uncertain. The social environment of Baltimore in 1849 continues to draw scrutiny. Election violence was not merely rumor, it was documented reality. Newspaper archives from the period describe fights, coercion, and arrests. But Poe's name does not appear in reports connected to such disturbances. This absence can be interpreted in multiple ways. It may suggest he was not involved, or it may reflect the low priority given to documenting the ordeal of a man perceived as intoxicated or marginal. The borrowed clothes remain perhaps the most stubborn detail. Clothing can signal identity, status, and movement. If Poe had been robbed, where were his original garments? If he had pawned them for money, why is there no record? Pawn shops did operate in Baltimore at the time, yet no documentation links his belongings to such transactions. If he was forcibly dressed in different attire for election fraud, why was he abandoned rather than retained until polls closed? One possibility is that whatever happened to him did not unfold according to plan. If he was part of a coercive scheme and became gravely ill or injured, those responsible may have released him to avoid liability. That would explain why he was found outside rather than hidden. Yet again, no witness corroborates this scenario. The final hours described by Dr. Moran include intervals of relative calm. This pattern of alternating lucidity and delirium aligns with several medical conditions, including encephalitis, sepsis, and metabolic disorders. It also aligns with certain types of head trauma. A slow intracranial bleed can produce exactly such fluctuations before culminating in fatal pressure on the brain. Historians examining the broader arc of Poe's life note that he had experienced episodes of physical collapse before. There are documented instances of sudden illness during his earlier years, though descriptions are vague. Some suggest he may have suffered from a chronic neurological vulnerability. If so, stress or minor injury during travel could have triggered a fatal episode. What complicates every theory is the scarcity of neutral documentation. Most surviving accounts were written by individuals with personal or ideological motives. Griswold had reason to emphasize moral weakness. Snodgrass had reason to highlight alcohol as a cautionary tale. Moran had reason to dramatize his role as attending physician. Each narrative lens shapes perception. In the absence of clear evidence, cultural myth fills the gap. Poe's death has been portrayed in novels, films, and speculative biographies as murder, conspiracy, divine punishment, or poetic fate. Yet, when stripped of embellishment, the case returns to a few hard facts and many uncertainties. The city of Baltimore has, over time, embraced Poe as part of its heritage. Westminster Hall and Burying Ground, where he rests, attracts visitors. Annually, his grave is marked and maintained. Commemorations honor his literary contributions. Yet even at the site of his burial, guides acknowledge that the precise cause of his death remains unknown. The mystery endures not because it is unsolvable in principle, but because the primary evidence was never preserved. If hospital notes had survived, if an autopsy had been conducted, if police reports had detailed his discovery, the case might have closed within weeks. Instead, history inherited fragments. Modern investigative standards emphasize chain of custody, documentation, and independent verification. None of those safeguards were firmly established in 1849. As a result, Poe's final days illustrate the vulnerability of truth in transitional eras of record-keeping. Nearly 200 years later, the file remains a collection of letters, newspaper clippings, and contradictory testimony. The theories cooping, rabies, alcohol, trauma, Illness each explain portions of the narrative but fail to encompass it entirely. Perhaps the most realistic conclusion is that his death resulted from a convergence of circumstances: physical fragility, environmental risk, and inadequate medical intervention. On October 7, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe died at Washington College Hospital. He did not leave behind a confession, an explanation, or a final manuscript clarifying his ordeal. What he left was uncertainty. That uncertainty persists as part of his legacy. A man who examined the boundaries between reason and madness exited the world in a state that blurred those same boundaries. The historical record offers no final verdict, only a timeline, a name repeated in delirium, and borrowed clothes on a Baltimore street. The case remains open, not in expectation of new evidence, but as a testament to how easily definitive answers can vanish.
As the 21st century advances, the investigation into Edgar Allan Poe's death has entered a quieter phase. The urgency has faded, but the questions remain. Scholars now approach the case less as a mystery to be dramatically solved and more as a historical reconstruction limited by the fragile nature of 19th century documentation. In doing so, the focus shifts from sensational conclusions to probability, context, and restraint. One of the most overlooked aspects of Poe's final days is the physical toll of travel in 1849. Rail systems were expanding, but routes were indirect and uncomfortable. Travel between Richmond and Baltimore often involved multiple segments by train and steamboat. Delays were common. Weather conditions in late September could fluctuate, and travelers were exposed to damp conditions and unsanitary environments. A man already fatigued or mildly ill could deteriorate rapidly under such strain. There is evidence that Poe had experienced periods of physical weakness throughout his life. Letters from acquaintances mention bouts of fever and collapse years earlier. While these accounts are vague, they suggest that his health may not have been robust. If he embarked on his journey already compromised, whether by infection, malnutrition, or exhaustion, he may have been far more vulnerable than observers realized. Another factor often minimized is dehydration. In cases of prolonged confusion or delirium, dehydration can both cause and accelerate neurological decline. A traveler without reliable access to food and water, particularly if disoriented or robbed, could spiral quickly. In 1849, there was little understanding of fluid management in acute illness. Hospitals did not administer intravenous hydration. A patient who arrived already dehydrated might not recover. The psychological strain of Poe's life cannot be separated entirely from physical vulnerability. By the time of his final journey, he had endured the death of his wife Virginia just 2 years earlier. Grief of that magnitude can have lasting physiological consequences, weakening immune response and altering stress hormones. He was also navigating professional tensions and preparing for remarriage. Emotional transitions, even hopeful ones, can be destabilizing. The question of timing continues to invite scrutiny. Poe was found on October 3, which was Election Day in Baltimore. The coincidence remains central to the couping theory. However, some historians argue that Baltimore's election disturbances were more pronounced in certain wards than others, and it is unclear whether Gunners Hall was a major hub of violence that day. Newspaper archives mention election unrest generally, but none explicitly connect Poe's discovery to a riot or arrest. Still, the detail of borrowed clothing cannot be dismissed as minor. Clothing represents continuity. For a traveler, it carries personal belongings, letters, and identification. If Poe's original clothes were removed, what became of the items they contained? No surviving inventory lists his possessions upon hospital admission. If he had money or documents, their absence is undocumented. The silence may suggest they were lost before he reached the hospital, or it may simply reflect incomplete record-keeping. Some modern researchers have examined the possibility of accidental poisoning. In the mid-19th century, alcohol was sometimes adulterated with toxic substances. Cheap liquor could contain methanol or other contaminants capable of causing confusion, blindness, or death. If Poe consumed tainted alcohol, whether voluntarily or under duress, the neurological symptoms might align. However, methanol poisoning often results in severe visual disturbances and prolonged deterioration rather than death within 4 days. Again, the match is imperfect. Another hypothesis involves hypoglycemia. If Poe had an undiagnosed metabolic disorder, extended travel without proper meals could have caused sudden cognitive collapse. Untreated hypoglycemia can lead to confusion, erratic behavior, and eventual coma. In a pre-insulin era, diabetes was poorly understood, yet there is no documented history of excessive thirst, weight loss, or other diabetic symptoms in Poe's correspondence. The rabies theory, while compelling to some, faces a similar obstacle. Rabies typically produces escalating neurological symptoms, including extreme sensitivity to stimuli. Dr. Morin's earliest accounts do not emphasize violent spasms or aversion to water, though they do describe agitation. Without more detailed clinical observation, the theory remains possible but unconfirmed. As decades passed, some researchers attempted statistical reasoning. Among middle-aged men in 1849, the most common causes of sudden death included infectious disease, complications of alcohol use, and trauma. Infectious diseases were widespread and often fatal. Pneumonia, influenza, and meningitis could progress quickly without antibiotics. The recorded term, congestion of the brain, was frequently applied to severe infections affecting the central nervous system. The phrase itself deserves scrutiny. Congestion of the brain was a broad diagnosis used in the 19th century to describe swelling, inflammation, or increased blood flow in the brain. It was not a precise medical term. It could encompass stroke, infection, trauma, or toxic reaction. In modern terminology, it conveys little specificity. One of the most sobering aspects of the case is how ordinary some explanations may be. While conspiracy theories attract attention, the majority of 19th century deaths resulted from illness compounded by limited medical intervention. It is entirely possible that Poe's death, though mysterious in detail, was medically unremarkable in context. Yet the unanswered elements continue to resist closure. Why could he not explain his condition when found? Why did he fail to recognize his surroundings? Why was no friend or acquaintance aware of his presence in Baltimore during those missing days? The silence suggests isolation. Isolation is perhaps the most consistent thread. Poe traveled alone. He fell ill or encountered difficulty alone. He was found alone. Even in the hospital, he was attended by physicians but lacked close family at his bedside. His mother-in-law and fiancée were not present. In the 19th century, family members often advocated for patience. Poe did not have that immediate support in Baltimore. When he died on October 7, 1849, the news spread gradually. Newspapers reported his passing with brief notices. Only later did the mystery gain prominence. His body was buried in an unmarked grave at Westminster Burying Ground. It would be decades before a proper monument was erected. In death, as in life, recognition was delayed. The endurance of this case speaks to the power of incomplete narratives. Humans seek resolution. When resolution is absent, we supply it. But historical integrity demands restraint. The most honest conclusion may be that Edgar Allan Poe died as many did in his era, suddenly, with limited documentation, amid social and medical conditions that did not prioritize precise record-keeping. And yet, the borrowed clothes remain. The name Reynolds remains. The missing hospital records remain. These details prevent the case from settling fully into medical probability. They leave open the possibility of external interference, of events in those missing days that altered the course of his life. Nearly 2 centuries later, no new documents have surfaced to clarify the matter. The passage of time reduces the likelihood that definitive evidence will emerge. What remains is a case defined by absence. Edgar Allan Poe departed Richmond with intention. He arrived in Baltimore in distress. Within 4 days, he was dead. Between those points lies a silence that history has not broken. The file remains open, not because it awaits a dramatic revelation, but because its central questions have never been answered with certainty. As historical investigation continues into the modern era, Edgar Allan Poe's final days have become less about identifying a single dramatic cause and more about understanding how uncertainty survives. The case now exists at the intersection of literature, medicine, and urban history. Each discipline contributes perspective, yet none can fully close the gap left by October 1849. One element increasingly examined by contemporary scholars is timing in relation to cognitive decline. Witnesses described Poe as incoherent when found on October 3, yet not entirely unconscious. This suggests that whatever afflicted him was already advanced by the time he was discovered. If the onset began days earlier, then his disappearance between September 27 and October 3 becomes even more critical. A slow-building infection or internal injury could have been progressing unnoticed while he traveled. Travel records from that era were inconsistent. Passenger lists were not always preserved, especially for short rail segments. Steamboat manifests were sometimes recorded but not systematically archived. The absence of Poe's name in surviving travel documents does not prove he failed to board transportation. It simply reflects incomplete preservation. In practical terms, this means his precise movements cannot be reconstructed with certainty. The environment he entered upon reaching Baltimore must also be considered carefully. Mid-19th century cities were dense, loud, and unsanitary. Street violence was not rare. Taverns functioned as political centers, polling places, and social hubs. A man who appeared disoriented might have drawn attention quickly, whether from those seeking to help or those seeking to exploit. If Poe arrived already ill, he may have been perceived as intoxicated and treated dismissively. Perception is central to this case. In 1849, intoxication was often assumed before illness. A confused man in public might be judged morally rather than medically. If Poe was indeed sick rather than drunk, early intervention may have been delayed because observers misinterpreted his symptoms. The line between drunkenness and neurological distress can appear thin without diagnostic tools. There is also the possibility of exposure. Autumn nights in Baltimore could be cold and damp. If Poe spent hours outdoors before being discovered, hypothermia may have contributed to cognitive impairment. Even mild hypothermia can intensify confusion, particularly in weakened individuals. Combined with dehydration, malnutrition, or underlying infection, environmental stress could have compounded his decline. Another angle rarely explored in depth involves financial vulnerability. Poe was not wealthy. If he lost or spent most of his travel funds before reaching Baltimore, he may have been unable to secure proper lodging. Poverty can accelerate crisis. A traveler without resources becomes more exposed to both illness and exploitation. Yet again, no ledger or personal account book survives to clarify how much money he carried. When considering the possibility of violence, it is important to note that not all injuries leave visible marks. A single blow to the head might produce internal bleeding without obvious external trauma. In an era before neurological imaging, such an injury would be indistinguishable from other forms of delirium. Dr. Morin did not record obvious wounds in his early letters, but absence of mention is not proof of absence. The cooping theory continues to attract attention because it explains two specific anomalies simultaneously: location and clothing. However, the practice of cooping typically required multiple participants and temporary detention sites. No surviving testimony links Poe directly to such a group. If he was a victim, he left no statement identifying captors. Given his prolonged delirium, perhaps he was never capable of doing so. As historians refine their approach, Many now emphasize the likelihood of multiple contributing factors rather than a singular dramatic cause. A mild infection may have impaired his judgment. Fatigue from travel may have weakened him further. Disorientation could have made him susceptible to robbery or coercion. Subsequent exposure or inadequate medical treatment may have sealed his fate. In complex cases, outcomes often result from convergence rather than one decisive event. The role of Washington College Hospital also deserves sober evaluation. 19th-century hospitals were not the institutions of controlled hygiene recognized today. Physicians relied on limited diagnostic frameworks. The diagnosis, congestion of the brain, was not unusual. It was a placeholder for conditions they could not classify precisely. Treatments may have included bloodletting or purging, practices believed to relieve pressure, but which could worsen dehydration and shock. The final hours described by Morin remain ambiguous. Reports suggest periods of agitation interspersed with relative quiet. If Poe was conscious enough to speak, even briefly, it is striking that no coherent narrative of his experience was recorded. Either he was incapable of articulating events, or his statements were fragmented beyond usefulness. This silence at the center of the case is perhaps its most defining feature. Over time, cultural retellings have magnified certain elements while overlooking others. The repetition of the name Reynolds has taken on symbolic weight, though its meaning remains uncertain. Some scholars now question whether the name was accurately recorded at all, suggesting that early transcription errors may have altered what was actually said. With no audio record and conflicting testimony, certainty is impossible. The transformation of Poe's death into legend reflects a broader human tendency. When a public figure dies under unclear circumstances, narrative fills the void. In Poe's case, the dark tone of his literary work encouraged readers to perceive hidden drama. Yet the simplest explanation, serious illness in an era of limited medicine, remains statistically credible. Still, statistics cannot erase the specific details that continue to unsettle researchers. The borrowed clothes suggest interruption of normal life. The Election Day discovery suggests chaotic surroundings. The missing medical records suggest administrative failure or loss. Each piece alone might be explained. Together, they resist final clarity. As the bicentennial commemorations of Poe's birth passed and scholarship matured, a consensus of caution emerged. Most modern historians refrain from endorsing a single definitive cause. Instead, they present a hierarchy of probability: infectious disease or metabolic disorder as medically plausible, alcohol-related complications as possible but not certain, cooping as circumstantially consistent yet unproven, rabies as intriguing but debated, trauma as plausible but undocumented. In legal terms, the case would likely be classified as undetermined cause of death. There is insufficient evidence to rule conclusively in favor of one explanation or eliminate all others. Edgar Allan Poe died on October 7, 1849, at age 40. He was buried quietly. His literary reputation grew posthumously, overshadowing the ambiguity of his final days. Yet beneath the monuments and anniversaries lies an unresolved human story, a traveler who left one city with purpose and arrived in another in distress, unable to explain the transformation. The passage of nearly 2 centuries has not yielded decisive evidence. Archives have been searched, letters have been analyzed, medical theories have been tested against fragmentary descriptions. No breakthrough has emerged. What remains is a record defined by gaps, and in those gaps, interpretation persists. Whether illness, violence, political corruption, or tragic coincidence ended his life, the truth dissolved almost as soon as it occurred. The file remains open, not in expectation of sudden revelation, but as acknowledgement that some historical events conclude without resolution. In the quiet that follows nearly 2 centuries of speculation, what remains most striking about Edgar Allan Poe's final days is not any single theory, but the structure of the mystery itself. It is built not on hidden documents waiting to be uncovered, but on absences that were never filled. The case persists because there is no decisive contradiction, no single fact strong enough to collapse the competing explanations. When modern historians reconstruct the final week of September 1849, they begin in Richmond. Poe was there, engaged in social visits, speaking publicly, and planning a return north. Several acquaintances later stated that he appeared stable and sober. He had reconnected with his childhood companion Sarah Elmira Royster and was discussing marriage. He had professional ambitions still in motion. These details matter because they counter the narrative of a man already spiraling. If he was deteriorating physically or mentally, it was not visibly evident to those around him. Then he departed. From that moment until October 3, the trail fades. There are no confirmed letters written in those days, no verified witnesses placing him clearly in Philadelphia, though he had intended to travel there. No preserved ticket stub or lodging registry bearing his name. For 6 days, the record falls silent. The silence itself suggests vulnerability. A traveler in 1849 moved through public yet poorly documented spaces. If he fell ill during transit, fellow passengers may have assumed intoxication. If he lost money or belongings, there was little recourse. If he was the victim of theft, he might have been left with nothing but the clothes he wore, unless those clothes, too, were taken. When Joseph Walker found him outside Gunner's Hall, Poe was described as wearing a coarse wool coat, dirty trousers, and a straw hat. Friends later insisted these were not his garments. Clothing in that era was a significant investment. It was altered to fit and worn for years. To appear in mismatched attire suggests abrupt disruption. Yet disruption does not automatically imply conspiracy. Theft alone could account for the change. If Poe was robbed of his belongings and stripped of recognizable clothing, the thieves might have left him in cast-off garments to avoid drawing attention. That scenario requires no organized political scheme, only opportunistic crime. Still, the election context remains relevant. Baltimore elections in the mid-19th century were notoriously turbulent. Multiple wards experienced violence and intimidation. Gunner's Hall functioned as a polling site, placing Poe's discovery within a politically charged environment. Whether coincidence or connection, the overlap remains unresolved. Medical reconstruction continues to focus on symptom progression. Delirium without sustained lucidity often indicates systemic failure, either infection spreading to the brain, severe metabolic imbalance, or traumatic injury. If Poe had suffered a blow to the head days earlier, symptoms could have intensified gradually. Alternatively, encephalitis, brain inflammation caused by viral infection, can begin with mild fever and progress rapidly to confusion and death. The absence of documented fever is notable but not definitive. Dr. Morin's earliest letters do not provide a detailed temperature record. 19th century physicians did not always record vital signs systematically. If fever was present but unremarkable in their view, it may have gone unmentioned. Alcohol-related explanations persist partly because of Poe's known sensitivity to it. Some contemporaries observed that even small quantities affected him disproportionately. This could suggest an underlying medical condition that amplified alcohol's impact. However, evidence of recent heavy consumption before his death is inconsistent. Without toxicology, the debate cannot be settled. Another rarely discussed factor is infection from minor injury. In an era before antiseptics were widely practiced, even small wounds could lead to systemic infection. If Poe sustained a cut or bruise that became infected, sepsis could develop. Sepsis can produce confusion, rapid decline, and death within days. External signs might be minimal, especially if overlooked. The hospital environment deserves continued scrutiny. Washington College Hospital was not designed for long-term neurological care. Patients were often grouped in wards. Sanitation practices were evolving but incomplete. If Poe was agitated, restraints may have been used. Sedatives such as laudanum were common, though their administration in his case is undocumented. Laudanum itself could complicate mental status. As historians sift through these possibilities, one reality becomes clearer. 19th century diagnostic language was broad because medical knowledge was still developing. Congestion of the brain reflected observation of swelling or altered consciousness, not precise pathology. Modern categories cannot be retroactively imposed with certainty. The social aftermath of his death further complicated the narrative. Rufus Griswold's damaging obituary shaped public perception immediately. By portraying Poe as morally flawed and self-destructive, Griswold created a framework through which the death was interpreted. For decades, readers assumed excess and vice were the underlying causes. Only later did scholars challenge that portrayal. In the 20th century, as Poe's literary stature rose globally, efforts to rehabilitate his image intensified. Defending his character sometimes led to overcorrection, with alternative theories elevated in reaction to moralistic accounts. The mystery thus became entangled not only with evidence, but with reputation. Meanwhile, the physical evidence deteriorated. Poe's original grave was modest and unmarked. When his remains were moved in 1875 to a more prominent monument, observers described unusual findings within the coffin. Yet the conditions of decomposition after 26 years made reliable interpretation nearly impossible. No scientific examination was conducted by modern standards. By the early 21st century, most serious scholars acknowledged that the probability of new primary evidence emerging is extremely low. The hospital records are unlikely to be found. Personal letters from the missing days have not surfaced. The identities of any potential assailants or abductors, if they existed, are lost to time. What remains, therefore, is a layered probability rather than a conclusion. The simplest explanation, acute medical illness complicated by environmental stress and inadequate care, accounts for much of the timeline. The more complex explanations, cooping, targeted violence, rabies, address specific anomalies but lack comprehensive proof. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that Poe's death sits at the edge of historical visibility. Enough detail survives to suggest unusual circumstances. Not enough survives to confirm them. His life ended at 40 during travel, under conditions of confusion and vulnerability. Whether those conditions arose from disease, assault, exploitation, or some combination, the precise mechanism slipped away almost immediately. In the end, Edgar Allan Poe's final chapter remains incomplete not because it is theatrical, but because it unfolded in a time when documentation was fragile and interpretation was swift. He was found outside a polling place in borrowed clothes. He spoke words that were imperfectly recorded. He died without clarity. The questions persist. The record does not close, and in that unresolved space, the case continues to exist, less as legend and more as a quiet reminder of how easily certainty can vanish. In the final assessment of Edgar Allan Poe's death, what endures is not a revelation but a boundary, a point beyond which the historical record simply does not extend. The documents stop. The witnesses contradict one another. The medical terminology dissolves into generalities, and so the last days of his life remain suspended between explanation and doubt. If we strip the case to its most defensible facts, the outline is stark. On September 27, 1849, Poe left Richmond with plans and obligations ahead of him. He was engaged, professionally active, and by several accounts sober. Sometime during the next 6 days, something altered his condition dramatically. On October 3, he was discovered in Baltimore, disoriented, wearing clothes that were not his own, outside a building functioning as a polling place. He could not account for himself. He was admitted to Washington College Hospital. On October 7, he died. The stated cause was congestion of the brain. Everything beyond that outline is interpretation. Over generations, the interpretations have shifted with cultural priorities. In the immediate aftermath, moralists framed his death as the inevitable result of vice. Later scholars resisted that framing and sought medical or criminal explanations. 20th-century physicians proposed rabies. Historians revisited election violence. Biographers weighed trauma and mental health. Each wave of analysis reflected both available evidence and contemporary concerns. What remains consistent across all serious inquiry is the acknowledgement of uncertainty. No autopsy report survives. No hospital chart details his vital signs. No confirmed eyewitness account describes the missing days with clarity. The essential pieces that would allow modern forensic closure were never preserved. It is tempting to search for a dramatic ending fitting the author of tales of madness and mortality, yet history does not bend to narrative symmetry. The available evidence suggests vulnerability more than conspiracy. A traveler alone, a body under strain, a city in political turmoil, medical care limited by its time. The borrowed clothing remains the most concrete anomaly. It signals disruption, whether theft, coercion, or desperate exchange. The location outside a polling place suggests coincidence or proximity to unrest. The repeated name, Reynolds, suggests a fragment of consciousness reaching for meaning, but none of these details alone can sustain a definitive theory. When evaluating probability, the most restrained conclusion is that Poe likely suffered an acute medical crisis during travel, possibly infectious or neurological, made worse by dehydration, exhaustion, or injury. That crisis may have rendered him disoriented and exposed to exploitation. By the time he was discovered, the underlying condition had advanced beyond recovery. 19th-century medicine lacked the tools to reverse such decline. Yet even that measured reconstruction must be offered with caution. It explains much, but not all. And the historian's responsibility is not to fill every silence, but to respect the limits of evidence. In the years after his death, Poe's literary influence expanded dramatically. His exploration of psychological complexity, unreliable perception, and the thin boundary between reason and madness shaped modern fiction and detective literature. Ironically, the author who invented fictional analytical reasoning through C. Auguste Dupin left behind a real-life mystery resistant to analysis. Visitors to his grave in Baltimore today encounter a monument that stands in quiet contrast to the uncertainty surrounding his final days. The stone is solid, the inscription clear, the dates fixed, but beneath those dates lies a gap of 6 days that history cannot illuminate fully. Edgar Allan Poe died on October 7, 1849 at the age of 40. Whether illness, injury, intoxication, coercion, or some convergence of factors ended his life cannot be determined with certainty. The hospital records are gone. The witnesses are long silent. The city has changed beyond recognition. The case does not close with revelation. It closes with absence. And perhaps that is the final truth preserved by the record, that even in the life of a writer who understood suspense, not every mystery yields its answer. Some remain defined by what cannot be recovered.